The sweet aroma of chocolate drifted through the bombed-out streets of Naples in October 1944, following 8-year-old Maria Benedetti like a whisper of hope through the rubble. She had never smelled anything so rich, so impossibly decadent, in a world where even bread had become a distant memory. What she discovered when she followed that scent would change not just her life, but her entire understanding of who could be trusted in a world torn apart by war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maria's bare feet picked their way carefully across the jagged stones and twisted metal that had once been Via Roma, one of Naples' proudest boulevards. The October sun cast long shadows through the skeletal remains of buildings, their windows blown out like empty eye sockets, staring down at the devastation below. Her stomach cramped with familiar hunger pangs, a constant companion for the past 2 years, since her father had disappeared with the retreating Italian army, and her mother had grown too weak to leave their makeshift shelter in the basement of what used to be the Chiesa di San Giuseppe. The chocolate smell grew stronger as she approached what had once been the grand Piazza del Plebiscito, now a wasteland of crater holes and abandoned military equipment. Maria had learned to be cautious about following unfamiliar scents or sounds. The German soldiers who had occupied Naples for months had been unpredictable and often cruel. Local children whispered stories of kids who had approached enemy soldiers seeking food, only to be turned away with harsh words, or worse. But this smell was different somehow, warmer and more inviting than anything she had encountered in her young life. As she crept closer to the source of the aroma, Maria heard something equally foreign to her war-torn world: laughter. Not the bitter, desperate laughter of adults who had lost everything, but genuine, easy laughter, mixed with voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. She pressed herself against the remains of a marble pillar and peered around its edge, her dark eyes widening at the scene before her. 3 soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms sat on wooden crates arranged in a rough circle, sharing what appeared to be thick, dark squares that they broke off from larger bars. These weren't German soldiers with their harsh, angular uniforms and stern expressions. These men wore different-colored clothing, olive green with patches she had never seen before, and their faces held a relaxation and kindness that seemed impossible in wartime Naples. One of them, a young man with sandy brown hair and gentle eyes, was carefully unwrapping more of the dark squares, breaking them into smaller pieces and placing them on a makeshift table made from a wooden ammunition box. Maria's hunger overcame her caution as she took a half-step forward, her foot dislodging a small piece of rubble that clattered across the broken pavement. All 3 soldiers looked up immediately, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons before they saw the source of the sound. Instead of the alarm or anger Maria expected, the sandy-haired soldier's face broke into the kindest smile she had seen since before the war began. He said something in his foreign language to his companions, then stood slowly, his movements deliberately non-threatening as he approached her hiding place. "Ciao, piccola," he said in heavily accented but recognizable Italian, his voice gentle and warm. "Come stai." His attempt at her language was clumsy but sincere, and Maria found herself stepping out from behind the pillar despite every survival instinct telling her to run. The soldier knelt down to her eye level, making himself smaller and less intimidating, and held out one of the dark squares. "Cioccolato," he said, pointing to the square and then to his mouth, making an exaggerated gesture of enjoyment. Maria had heard of chocolate before the war, had seen it in the windows of fancy shops that her family could never afford to enter, but she had never imagined she would actually taste it. Her small hand reached out trembling, not just from hunger, but from the impossibility of the moment. An enemy soldier, or at least someone she had been taught to fear, was offering her something precious and wonderful. The chocolate was still slightly warm from the afternoon sun, and when she bit into it, the rich sweetness exploded across her taste buds in a way that made her close her eyes and forget, for just a moment, about the hunger and the fear and the endless gray uncertainty that had become her normal life. The soldier watched her reaction with evident pleasure, then turned and called to his companions. They exchanged words in their foreign language before one of them, A tall man with dark hair and kind eyes approached carrying what Maria recognized as a medical bag. She instinctively stepped backward, memories of harsh treatments and rough handling from previous encounters with authority figures making her wary. But the sandy-haired soldier held up his hands peacefully, then pointed to a scrape on Maria's arm that she had forgotten about, acquired during her morning search through the rubble for anything useful or edible. Medico, the soldier said, pointing to his companion and then making gentle dabbing motions near the scrape without actually touching her. Aiutare, help. His Italian was limited, but his intent was clear. Maria looked down at her arm, noticing for the first time how the scrape had become red and slightly swollen around the edges. In the chaos of survival, minor injuries were often ignored until they became major problems, and her mother was too weak now to tend to such things properly. The tall soldier, with the medical bag, knelt down beside his companion and opened the bag, revealing an array of supplies that seemed impossibly clean and new in the midst of Naples' destruction. He pulled out a small bottle of clear liquid and a white cloth, showing them to Maria before making the same gentle dabbing motions his friend had demonstrated. His eyes were patient and kind, and he waited for her permission rather than simply proceeding, a courtesy that no adult had shown her in months. Maria nodded hesitantly, and the medic began cleaning her wound with a gentleness she had almost forgotten existed. The liquid stung slightly, but not in the harsh, burning way she expected. Instead, it felt clean and healing, and as he worked, the medic hummed a tune she didn't recognize, something soft and melodic that seemed to come from a world where people had time and energy for music. When he finished cleaning the scrape, he applied a small bandage that was whiter and cleaner than anything Maria had seen since before the bombing began. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the medic packed up his supplies, the sandy-haired soldier broke off another piece of chocolate and offered it to Maria, along with something else that made her eyes widen in disbelief. A small metal container that, when opened, revealed crackers and what appeared to be some kind of meat spread. Food that wasn't moldy or crawling with insects, food that had been carefully preserved and packaged. He gestured for her to eat, his expression encouraging and patient as she hesitantly tasted the unfamiliar but delicious combination. While Maria ate, the three soldiers continued their conversation in their foreign language, but their voices remained gentle and relaxed. Occasionally one of them would smile at her or make a friendly gesture, and gradually she began to understand that these weren't the frightening enemies she had been taught to expect. Their uniforms were clean and well-maintained, their equipment modern and plentiful, and their attitudes suggested people who came from a place where there was enough of everything to go around. The third soldier, who had been quietly watching the interaction, reached into his pack and pulled out something that made Maria's breath catch in her throat, a small photograph of a young girl who appeared to be about her own age, with dark curls and a bright smile, standing next to a woman who was obviously her mother. The soldier showed Maria the photograph, pointing to himself, and then to the images with an expression of love and longing that transcended language barriers. "Mi figlia," he said carefully, using one of the few Italian phrases he seemed to know. "My daughter." He pointed to Maria and then back to the photograph, and she understood that he was seeing his own child in her face, that his kindness came not just from duty or training, but from the heart of a father who missed his little girl. This revelation transformed everything for Maria. These weren't faceless enemies or mysterious foreigners. They were fathers and sons and brothers who carried pictures of their families and worried about children far away from the war. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, more sounds began to drift across the destroyed piazza. Maria heard voices, small and hesitant at first, then growing bolder. She turned to see other children emerging from the rubble, like flowers pushing through cracks in concrete. There was Giuseppe, the baker's son, who had lost his left arm in the bombing of his family's shop. There was little Anna Rossi, whose parents had sent her to live with her grandmother after their house was destroyed. There was Marco, who never spoke anymore since witnessing something terrible during the German occupation. One by one, drawn by the impossible aroma of chocolate and the sound of gentle laughter, the forgotten children of Naples began to appear. Each one was thin, dirty, and marked by the trauma of war, but also filled with the resilient curiosity that keeps children moving forward, even in the darkest circumstances. The American soldiers, for Maria was beginning to understand that's what they were. The Americans she had heard whispered about but never seen, welcomed each new arrival with the same patient kindness they had shown her. The sandy-haired soldier, who had introduced himself as Tommy, in his careful Italian, began breaking chocolate into smaller and smaller pieces as more children arrived, ensuring that everyone received a share. The medic, whose name sounded like Frank when he said it, began examining the various cuts, scrapes and infections that marked each child's body, treating each wound with the same careful attention he had given to Maria's small scrape. The third soldier, Joe, shared his photographs not just of his daughter, but of his entire family, using gestures and simple words to tell stories that made the children smile despite their circumstances. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the devastated piazza, something magical was happening. The children, who had spent months hiding in shadows and fighting over scraps of moldy bread, were sitting in a circle with enemy soldiers, sharing food and stories and moments of genuine human connection. Giuseppe was demonstrating how he could whistle despite his missing teeth, making the soldiers laugh and clap. Anna was braiding blades of grass into small chains, placing them on the soldiers' heads like crowns, while they pretended to be honored royalty. Marco, who hadn't spoken in months, approached Frank the medic and quietly pointed to a scar on his forehead where shrapnel had grazed him during one of the bombings. Frank examined the healed wound gently, then reached into his medical bag and produced something that made all the children gasp in wonder: a small mirror. He showed Marco his reflection, pointing to where the scar was healing well and making encouraging sounds. Then, in a gesture that brought tears to Maria's eyes, Frank drew a small heart in the dust beside Marco's feet and pointed from the heart to Marco's chest, then to his own. Without words, he was telling the boy that he was loved, that he mattered, that someone cared about his pain. The transformation in Marco was instantaneous and profound. For the first time since the trauma that had stolen his voice, he smiled. Not the sad, broken smile of a child trying to please adults, but a genuine expression of joy and recognition. He pointed to Frank's medical bag and made a gesture as if he were treating a wound, then pointed to himself. Frank understood immediately and began showing Marco how to properly clean and bandage small cuts, turning the lesson into a game that had all the children laughing and volunteering to be, quote, patients. As darkness approached, Tommy began gathering up the remains of their impromptu feast, but not before ensuring that each child received additional chocolate and crackers to take with them. Joe had somehow produced small American flags from his pack, tiny versions that he presented to each child like medals of honor. The flags were clearly precious to him, part of his personal supplies, but he gave them away freely, understanding that these children needed symbols of hope more than he needed souvenirs. Frank had used nearly half of his medical supplies, treating the various minor injuries and infections the children presented, work that went far beyond his military duties, but that he approached with the dedication of a pediatrician in the finest hospital. Each bandage was applied with care, each antiseptic application accompanied by gentle words and reassuring touches. He gave Giuseppe a small tube of antibiotic ointment for the recurring infection, where his prosthetic arm rubbed against his skin. He showed Anna's grandmother, who had appeared looking for her granddaughter, how to properly clean and dress the child's persistent cough with basic hygiene measures. The evening air grew cooler, and one by one the children began to drift back toward their various shelters and hiding places, but none of them left empty-handed. They carried chocolate and crackers, American flags and clean bandages, but most importantly, they carried the memory of being treated with dignity and kindness by people who had every reason to see them as complications or problems. They had discovered that enemies could become friends, that soldiers could be healers, and that, even in the darkest moments of war, human compassion could light up the world like the sweetest chocolate melting on a hungry child's tongue. Maria was among the last to leave, reluctant to break the spell of safety and abundance that had settled over the piazza. Tommy knelt down one final time and pressed something into her small hand, a wrapped chocolate bar, whole and unbroken, more food than she had seen in months. But along with the chocolate, he gave her something even more precious. A small piece of paper with simple words written in careful Italian. Domani, stesso posto. Tomorrow, same place. As Maria made her way back through the rubble-strewn streets toward the basement shelter where her mother waited, she clutched the chocolate and the note against her chest like treasures beyond price. The familiar landscape of destruction looked somehow different now, less hopeless and more like a place where miracles could happen. She had followed the scent of chocolate and discovered something she had almost forgotten existed in the world: genuine kindness from unexpected sources, medical care given freely without expectation of payment, and the revolutionary idea that enemies could choose to be healers instead of destroyers. The chocolate bar seemed to pulse with warmth against her thin chest as she picked her way carefully through the debris, and Maria found herself smiling in the darkness, already counting the hours until tomorrow would bring her back to the piazza where American soldiers had shown her that even in wartime, there were people who chose to feed children rather than frighten them, who bandaged wounds rather than inflicted them, and who saw scared little girls not as problems to be avoided but as precious lives deserving of protection and care. The next morning arrived with the kind of golden sunlight that made even the bomb craters in Naples look like ancient Roman ruins rather than fresh wounds of war. Maria woke before dawn in the damp basement shelter, her mother's fevered breathing beside her, serving as a constant reminder of how fragile life had become. But today was different. Today she had a promise written on a small piece of paper, and the memory of chocolate still lingered on her tongue like a prayer answered by unexpected angels. She slipped quietly from their makeshift bed of salvaged blankets and newspapers, careful not to wake her mother, who had finally fallen into peaceful sleep after coughing through most of the night. Maria's fingers found the chocolate bar Tommy had given her, still carefully wrapped and hidden in the folds of her worn dress. She had saved every precious square, sharing tiny pieces with her mother the night before, watching as the rich sweetness had brought the first smile to Maria Benedetti's face in weeks. The streets of Naples in the early morning held a different quality than during the harsh daylight hours. Mist rose from the warm stones, and the absence of military vehicles and desperate scavenging crowds created an almost peaceful atmosphere. Maria moved through the familiar maze of rubble with the confidence of a child who had learned to navigate destruction, but her steps had a new purpose now. She wasn't just searching for survival, she was walking toward hope. As she approached the Piazza del Plebiscito, Maria heard something that made her heart leap with recognition: the sound of children's voices, excited and animated in a way she hadn't heard since before the war began. Giuseppe was already there, his one remaining arm gesturing enthusiastically as he spoke to Anna and Marco. Behind them she could see at least a dozen other children, some she recognized from the neighborhood, others who must have heard whispered stories about American soldiers who shared chocolate and treated wounds with gentle hands. But what took Maria's breath away was the transformation that had occurred in the piazza overnight. Where yesterday there had been only scattered crates and makeshift seating, today there was something that looked almost like a proper medical station. The 3 American soldiers had returned with additional supplies, and Frank the medic had set up what appeared to be a field hospital, complete with clean white sheets spread over boxes to create examination tables, medical equipment laid out with military precision, and supplies that seemed impossibly abundant in the context of war-torn Naples. Tommy spotted Maria approaching and waved enthusiastically, his face breaking into the same warm smile that had changed her world the day before. But today he wasn't alone in his enthusiasm. Standing beside him was another American soldier, a woman with kind eyes and gentle hands who was carefully organizing medical supplies with the efficiency of veteran, someone who had done this work many times before. Maria had never seen a female soldier before, and the sight filled her with a strange mixture of surprise and comfort. The woman soldier, who introduced herself as Lieutenant Sarah in carefully pronounced Italian, knelt down to Maria's eye level just as Tommy had done the day before. But her presence brought something new to the dynamic, a maternal warmth that seemed to wrap around the assembled children like an invisible blanket. She examined Maria's bandaged arm from the previous day, nodding approvingly at Frank's work, then gently asked in broken Italian about her mother's condition. Maria found herself describing her mother's persistent cough, the fever that came and went, and the weakness that had grown worse over the past weeks. Lieutenant Sarah listened intently, occasionally asking gentle questions that demonstrated both medical knowledge and genuine concern. When Maria finished her description, the lieutenant exchanged meaningful looks with Frank and Tommy, before reaching into her medical bag and producing small bottles and packages that she carefully explained were medicines for her mother. But Lieutenant Sarah's contribution went beyond medical supplies. She had brought something else that transformed the entire atmosphere of their makeshift clinic: dolls. Not fancy porcelain dolls from expensive shops, but simple cloth dolls that she had clearly made herself during quiet evening hours. Each doll was unique, with carefully embroidered faces and small dresses sewn from scraps of different colored fabric. She presented one to each girl present, explaining in her careful Italian that every child deserved something soft and beautiful to hold, especially during difficult times. Anna clutched her new doll against her chest and began to cry, but these weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude and recognition that someone had taken time and care to create something beautiful, specifically for children like her. The doll represented more than just a toy. It was proof that somewhere in the world, people still believed that childhood should contain moments of pure joy and wonder, even in the midst of war. As more children continued to arrive throughout the morning, word spreading through the underground networks that connected Naples, survivors, the American medical team adapted their approach to accommodate the growing crowd. Joe had revealed an unexpected talent for storytelling, using a combination of simple Italian words, elaborate gestures, and expressive facial expressions to tell tales that had the children laughing and gasping with excitement. His stories weren't about war or conflict, but about magical places where children rode horses through fields of flowers and families gathered around tables laden with more food than anyone could eat. Frank discovered that several of the children had more serious medical conditions that required ongoing attention. There was Lucia, whose persistent infections had gone untreated for months, slowly sapping her strength and spirit. There was Antonio, who had been partially deaf since a bomb explosion, but had never received proper medical evaluation or treatment options. There was Sophia, whose malnutrition had affected her growth and development in ways that required careful monitoring and specialized nutrition. Rather than treating these children as medical cases to be processed efficiently, Frank approached each one as if they were his own family members seeking care. He spent long minutes explaining to Antonio how sound worked, using simple demonstrations and drawing pictures in the dust to help the boy understand that his hearing loss wasn't a punishment or a shameful secret, but simply a condition that could be managed and accommodated. He showed Lucia's older sister how to properly clean and dress wounds, turning a medical necessity into an empowering skill that gave the family some control over their circumstances. Lieutenant Sarah's expertise proved invaluable when it came to addressing the psychological trauma that marked almost every child in varying degrees. She had clearly received training in recognizing and treating what would later be understood as post-traumatic stress, and she applied this knowledge with the intuitive sensitivity of someone who genuinely cared about children's emotional well-being. She organized simple games that allowed the children to express their fears and anxieties in safe, controlled ways, transforming therapeutic exercises into moments of genuine fun and connection. One of her most powerful interventions involved Marco, the boy who had lost his voice after witnessing something terrible during the German occupation. Instead of trying to force him to speak or focusing on what he couldn't do, Lieutenant Sarah engaged him in activities that celebrated his other forms of communication. She taught him simple sign language gestures that the other children could learn, creating a new language system that made Marco feel special rather than disabled. When he successfully taught Giuseppe how to sign "thank you," the joy on both boys' faces was radiant and transformative. As the day progressed, Tommy revealed that he had been busy during the evening hours as well. He had somehow acquired fresh fruit, real oranges and apples that seemed like miraculous treasures in wartime Naples. But more than just distributing the fruit, he turned the sharing into a lesson about gratitude and community. Each child received their portion only after helping to serve others, creating a system where generosity was rewarded and everyone learned the satisfaction of giving as well as receiving. The oranges were particularly meaningful because most of the children hadn't tasted fresh citrus fruit in over a year. The vitamin C would help combat the scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies that affected many of them. But the psychological impact was equally important. The bright color, fresh scent, and sweet juice represented abundance and health in ways that went beyond mere nutrition. Watching the children's faces as they bit into the fruit was like witnessing small miracles of pure happiness and sensory pleasure. Joe's contribution to the day's activities proved equally transformative in unexpected ways. He had discovered that several of the older children had been separated from their families during various evacuations and bombing raids. and he began organizing an informal communication network to help reunite families when possible. Using his military radio equipment during off-duty hours, he made contact with other American units stationed throughout southern Italy, passing along descriptions and names of missing family members. The radio itself became a source of wonder and hope for the children, who had never imagined that voices could travel instantly across vast distances. Joe let them listen to music broadcasts from Allied radio stations, exposing them to swing music and American popular songs that transported them mentally to a world where people had energy and leisure time for dancing and entertainment. Several of the children began attempting to dance to the unfamiliar rhythms, creating moments of pure joy and physical expression that contrasted sharply with the careful, fearful movements that had characterized their daily survival routines. But perhaps the most profound transformation occurred when Lieutenant Sarah made an announcement that left the children speechless with amazement. She explained that the American Army had established mobile medical units specifically designed to provide ongoing healthcare for civilian populations in liberated areas. These units would be returning to Naples regularly, not just once or twice, but as part of a systematic effort to restore health and normalcy to communities affected by war. This meant that the children's experience wasn't just a wonderful but temporary interruption in their harsh reality. It was the beginning of a sustained relationship with people who had resources, knowledge, and most importantly, the genuine desire to help them not just survive but thrive. The medical attention, the nutritious food, the educational opportunities, and the emotional support would continue as long as needed, growing and adapting as the children's circumstances improved. Frank took this opportunity to begin training some of the older children and available adults in basic first aid and hygiene practices. He understood that sustainable improvement in their conditions required transferring knowledge and skills to the community itself, not just providing temporary assistance. Using simple Italian and lots of hands-on demonstration, he taught them how to properly clean wounds, recognize signs of serious infection, prepare oral rehydration solutions for treating diarrhea, and identify symptoms that required professional medical attention. These lessons transformed the children from passive recipients of aid into active participants in their community's health and recovery. 12-year-old Francesca discovered she had a natural aptitude for medical care, learning quickly and helping translate Frank's instructions for younger children who struggled with the new concepts. 10-year-old Roberto found that teaching hygiene practices to other children gave him a sense of purpose and leadership that helped him process his own trauma through helping others. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the piazza, Lieutenant Sarah introduced one more element that would prove crucial to the children's long-term recovery: education. She had brought books, not just military manuals or religious texts, but actual children's books, with pictures and stories designed to engage young minds and nurture imagination. Most of the children hadn't seen new books in years, and many had forgotten that reading could be pleasurable rather than just functional. She organized reading circles where older children helped younger ones with difficult words, creating a collaborative learning environment that fostered both academic skills and social connections. The books transported the children mentally to places where adventures were exciting rather than terrifying, where problems were solved through cleverness and courage rather than just endured through resignation. For many of them, it was their first exposure to stories where children were heroes rather than victims. Tommy's contribution to the educational component focused on practical skills that would serve the children well in post-war reconstruction. He taught them basic English phrases, not just polite greetings but useful vocabulary related to trades and professions that would be valuable as Naples rebuilt. He showed them how American tools work differently from Italian equivalents, explaining mechanical principles in simple terms that sparked curiosity about engineering and technology. Joe's educational focus centered on geography and cultural exchange. Using maps and photographs, he showed the children where America was located relative to Italy, describing landscapes and customs that expanded their understanding of the wider world. His stories about American farms, cities, and families helped the children envision positive possibilities for their own futures, showing them that prosperity and peace were real conditions that existed somewhere, not just fantasies from books. As evening approached, and the time came for the children to return to their various shelters and hiding places, the atmosphere was markedly different from the previous day's reluctant departure. Today, the children left with concrete plans and specific commitments. Frank had scheduled individual medical appointments for those who needed ongoing treatment. Lieutenant Sarah had organized a weekly gathering specifically for the girls, focusing on health education and emotional support. Tommy had established a system for distributing food supplies that would ensure consistent nutrition rather than sporadic abundance. Joe had created what he called pen-pal partnerships, where each child who could write would correspond with American families who had volunteered to provide encouragement and small care packages. This initiative would give the children regular contact with people who cared about their well-being and progress, creating emotional connections that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. Maria walked home through the familiar rubble-strewn streets, but everything looked different now. Where yesterday she had seen only destruction and hopelessness, today she saw a community in the process of healing and rebuilding. The American soldiers had shown them that their suffering was temporary, that people with resources and knowledge were committed to helping them create better lives, and that children like her deserved not just survival but genuine opportunities for growth, education, and happiness. The chocolate had been delicious, the medical care had been essential, and the emotional support had been healing. But the most precious gift the Americans had given them was something more fundamental: the restoration of hope and the radical idea that strangers could choose to be family, that enemies could become healers, and that even in war's darkest moments, human kindness could create miracles that tasted sweeter than any chocolate ever made. 3 weeks later, Maria stood at the window of what had once been the Chiesa di San Giuseppe, but now served as Naples' first civilian medical clinic established by the American forces. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Where broken stained glass windows had once allowed cold wind and rain to sweep through the abandoned sanctuary, clean medical equipment now gleamed under electric lights that the Americans had somehow restored to working order. The altar had been converted into a pharmacy where Lieutenant Sarah carefully dispensed medications to a steady stream of Italian families who no longer had to choose between food and medicine for their children. Maria wore a clean dress that Lieutenant Sarah had somehow acquired, and her hair had been washed and braided with ribbons that Tommy had produced from his seemingly endless supply of small treasures. But more importantly, she wore an expression of confidence and purpose that would have been unimaginable just a month earlier. She had become Lieutenant Sarah's unofficial assistant, helping translate between the American medical staff and Italian patients, and learning medical procedures with the quick intelligence of a child whose mind had been starved for meaningful challenges. Her mother, Elena, sat in a comfortable chair that Frank had salvaged and repaired, no longer the fever-racked shadow of her former self, but a woman whose strength was returning daily thanks to proper nutrition and medical treatment. The persistent cough that had threatened to consume her life had yielded to antibiotics that the Americans provided without question or payment. Elena's transformation represented something larger than individual recovery. She had become a symbol of hope for other Italian mothers who had watched their families deteriorate under the grinding pressure of war and occupation. The clinic served far more than just Maria's immediate neighborhood. Word had spread throughout Naples and the surrounding countryside that American medics were providing free healthcare to civilians, treating Italian children with the same care and attention they would give their own families. Every morning brought new arrivals: farmers from the countryside carrying children with untreated injuries, elderly people who hadn't seen a doctor in years, young mothers whose babies needed vaccinations and nutritional support that had been unavailable during the occupation. But what made the clinic truly revolutionary wasn't just the medical care, though that was desperately needed and gratefully received. It was the way the Americans had chosen to organize their assistance. Rather than creating a traditional military operation where orders flowed downward and civilians remained passive recipients, they had established a collaborative community, where Italian adults and children became active participants in their own recovery and that of their neighbors. Giuseppe had discovered an unexpected talent for mechanical repair, working alongside Tommy to maintain the clinic's equipment and improvise solutions when replacement parts weren't available. His missing arm, which had once marked him as damaged and pitiful, now became almost an advantage, as he developed techniques for completing complex tasks with one hand that impressed even the American engineers. Tommy began teaching him English technical vocabulary, recognizing that Giuseppe had the intelligence and motivation to pursue advanced training that could lead to meaningful work in post-war reconstruction. Anna had evolved from a frightened child into a confident young leader who organized activities for the younger patients while they waited for medical attention. Her natural empathy and creativity made her invaluable in helping scared children feel safe and comfortable during medical procedures. Lieutenant Sarah began training Anna in basic child psychology techniques, teaching her how to recognize signs of trauma and use simple interventions to help other children process their experiences in healthy ways. Marco's communication abilities had flourished beyond anyone's expectations. The sign language that Lieutenant Sarah had taught him had evolved into a comprehensive system that dozens of children and adults now use to communicate complex ideas and emotions. More remarkably, his selective mutism had begun to resolve as he gained confidence and felt valued for his unique contributions. He had started speaking again, quietly at first, then with growing strength and clarity as he realized that his voice was welcome and his words had value. The radio network that Joe had established had achieved remarkable success in reuniting separated families. His evening broadcasts, transmitted to other American units throughout southern Italy, had helped locate dozens of missing relatives and facilitated emotional reunions that strengthened the entire community's faith in the possibility of restoration and healing. The radio room had become a gathering place where families shared news and stories, creating an informal communication network that connected isolated communities across the region. Frank's medical training program had graduated its first class of Italian paramedics, adults and older teenagers, who could now provide basic healthcare in remote areas where professional medical services remained unavailable. These newly trained medics carried not just medical supplies and knowledge, but the American philosophy of treating every patient with dignity and respect, regardless of their social status or ability to pay. They had become ambassadors of a different way of thinking about healthcare and community responsibility. The educational programs had expanded far beyond Lieutenant Sarah's original reading circles. Tommy had established a technical training workshop where Italian men learned welding, electrical work, and mechanical repair skills that would be essential for rebuilding Naples. Infrastructure. These weren't just job training programs. They were intensive courses that combined practical skills with the problem-solving approaches and work ethics that had made American industry so productive and efficient. Joe's geography and cultural exchange sessions had evolved into a comprehensive program that prepared selected Italian young people for potential immigration to America, providing them with language skills, cultural knowledge, and practical information about American society. But equally important, these sessions helped Italians develop pride in their own cultural heritage, while learning to appreciate the strengths of different approaches to social organization and economic development. The most profound transformation had occurred in the relationships between former enemies. Italian families had begun inviting American soldiers to their homes for meals, sharing their traditional recipes and family stories despite having barely enough food for themselves. These intimate gatherings created bonds that transcended nationality and military affiliation, proving that human connection could flourish, even in the most unlikely circumstances. American soldiers, in turn, had adopted Italian families as their own, sending portions of their military pay to help with expenses, and writing letters to their own families in America, describing the courage and resilience of the Italian people they had come to love. These personal relationships were creating a foundation for lasting friendship between the two nations that would prove more durable than any formal treaty or diplomatic agreement. The chocolate that had first drawn Maria to the Americans had evolved into something far more significant than a simple treat. The clinic now featured a small kitchen where Italian women taught American soldiers how to prepare traditional Italian dishes, while the soldiers shared American recipes and cooking techniques. Food had become a language of friendship and cultural exchange, with each shared meal strengthening the bonds between former enemies. Lieutenant Sarah had established a women's health program that addressed not just medical needs but the psychological trauma that many Italian women had experienced during the occupation. These support groups provided safe spaces where women could share their experiences and learn coping strategies, while also receiving practical education about nutrition, childcare, and family health management. The program had become a model for similar efforts throughout liberated Italy. The success of the Naples clinic had attracted attention from higher levels of American military command, who recognized that this approach to civilian assistance was achieving remarkable results in winning hearts and minds, while contributing to the stability and recovery of liberated territories. Plans were underway to replicate the Naples model in other Italian cities, using the lessons learned and the Italian staff trained in Naples to establish similar programs throughout the country. Maria's role in this expansion had grown beyond anyone's expectations, including her own. Her natural intelligence, language skills, and deep understanding of both American and Italian perspectives had made her invaluable as a cultural bridge between the two communities. Lieutenant Sarah had begun teaching her advanced medical procedures, recognizing that Maria had the potential to become a professional nurse or even a doctor if provided with proper educational opportunities. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Maria's transformation was the way she had learned to see herself and her possibilities. 3 weeks earlier, she had been a frightened child, focused entirely on day-to-day survival, unable to imagine any future beyond finding enough food to keep herself and her mother alive for another day. Now she was a young woman with dreams and plans, confident in her abilities, and surrounded by adults who believed in her potential and were committed to helping her achieve her goals. The other children had experienced similar transformations, each discovering talents and interests they never knew they possessed. The clinic had become not just a place of healing, but a laboratory for human potential, where children who had been written off as war casualties proved capable of remarkable growth and achievement when provided with proper support and encouragement. The physical transformation of the clinic building itself had become a symbol of hope for the entire city. What had been a bombed-out ruin had become a beacon of light and activity, with clean windows, painted walls, and gardens where Italian and American volunteers worked together to grow vegetables and flowers. The building's restoration demonstrated that destruction could be reversed, that beauty could be recreated, and that communities could rebuild themselves stronger than before. As winter approached, the clinic faced new challenges that tested the creativity and commitment of everyone involved. Heating fuel was scarce, medical supplies were increasingly difficult to obtain, and the American military was under pressure to redirect resources toward the continuing war effort. But instead of scaling back their efforts, the Italian and American staff worked together to find innovative solutions that actually strengthened their programs. Italian families donated whatever they could spare for heating fuel, creating a community-wide effort to keep the clinic warm and operational. Local craftsmen volunteered their time to make furniture and equipment, while Italian women sewed blankets and clothing for patients who needed warm garments. The Americans contributed their technical expertise and access to military supply networks. But the solutions increasingly reflected Italian ingenuity and resourcefulness. The collaboration had created something entirely new, a hybrid institution that combined American efficiency and resources with Italian creativity and community solidarity. Neither purely American nor purely Italian, the clinic represented a new model for international cooperation that transcended traditional categories of military occupation or humanitarian assistance. Maria often stood at the clinic window in the evening, watching Italian families and American soldiers working together in the garden, their children playing games that combined elements from both cultures, creating new traditions that belonged fully to neither America nor Italy, but to their shared experience of transformation and hope. These moments filled her with a profound sense of gratitude and purpose that she struggled to express in either language. The chocolate that had first brought her to the Americans had long since been consumed, but its sweetness lingered in memories that had fundamentally changed how she understood the world and her place in it. She had learned that enemies could become family, that strangers could show more kindness than neighbors, and that even the darkest circumstances could contain seeds of hope and transformation. As she prepared to leave the clinic each evening, Maria carried with her not just the medical supplies and food that ensured her family's continued health and survival, but something far more precious, the absolute certainty that tomorrow would bring new opportunities for growth, learning, and service to others. She had followed the scent of chocolate and discovered that the sweetest things in life weren't treats to be consumed, but relationships to be cherished, and purposes to be pursued with passion and dedication. The American soldiers had given her chocolate, medicine, education, and friendship. But most importantly, they had shown her that she deserved all of these things simply by virtue of being human, that her dreams and aspirations mattered, and that she had the power to create positive change in her own life and in the lives of others. This lesson, sweeter than any chocolate, would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead, and inspire her to extend the same kindness to others throughout the rest of her remarkable life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.